I had a student deferment to go to college and then law school, and it had been my intention, once I finished law school, to apply to the Judge Advocate General's corps of various services. And I did that, and the Army accepted me, and I entered in active duty in January of 1967. And the first place I went was to Fort Lee, Virginia. Unlike some of my counterparts, I had not had any previous military training. So many of them were in ROTC, or some had even been drafted and been in enlisted status, and then they applied for commission. But for those like myself who did not have that experience, they had a special course of 3 weeks for us to go to. This was in January, and it was quite cold, and we learned things like how to wear the uniform, how to salute, who you don't salute, and other things that might put into the category of general customs of the service. We also had a little bit of experience with rifle firing. We went to the rifle range, but as I said, the weather wasn't very good at that time, and we were scheduled to go on a survival exercise, and the survival exercise was canceled because of bad weather. After that, we went to the Judge Advocate General School of the Army, which is located on the campus of the University of Virginia. This was about a 12-week experience in which we learned about military law, probably with an emphasis on military justice, but also military administrative law, procurement regulations, and other things which we might encounter during our period of service. And I might not mention at the outset that my service obligation with this was 4 years. So it was a nice experience being at the University of Virginia. In fact, it's almost like going to a civilian law school. The way they conducted the classes and so forth was very similar to what I experienced at NYU Law School, which is where I went. I might add that in order to be commissioned in the Judge Advocates General's Corps, one had to be a graduate of an accredited law school and be admitted to the bar of one of the states. So when I graduated from law school, I took the bar exam in July, and we didn't get the results until October, I think it was October, maybe early November. And it was at that point that I contacted the Army, told them I passed the bar, and we made arrangements for me to go on active duty. So once we finished up at the JA school, the next place I went to was Fort Knox, Kentucky. And the reason I went there was, again, this was a program that was intended for those who'd been newly commissioned without previous military experience. And what it was at that time, the armor school of the Army was located at Fort Knox. And we were all enrolled in the Armor Officers Basic Course, the same course that was taken by newly commissioned armor officers. And we learned how to drive tanks and fire cannons and all this kind of stuff. It was interesting, but it was not quite what one might have expected. But looking back on it, I think it was a wise thing to do, in that you got some exposure to people who were, in what some might call the real Army, did on a daily basis. And that was 12 weeks, I think. And at the end of it, then I went to my first actual duty station, which was Fort Belvoir in Virginia. And that was just outside of Washington, D.C. And actually it's a very nice place to be stationed because of its proximity to D.C. and unlike some military bases, it wasn't all the way out in the boonies. So I was stationed there for about 10 months. and did a little bit of military justice, but not very much. Mostly my work was dealing with administrative law type things, and I had an assignment where I was assigned to be basically the legal officer for the hospital there. So a lot of my work involved that. And then eventually I came down in the waters to go to Vietnam, and this was in around April or so of 1968. And first thing we did in connection with that was went back to the JAG school and took a 2-week course about military law in Vietnam and what to expect and what types of duties might be expected to perform as a JAG officer in the combat zone, in general, in Vietnam in particular. And after that, then we had 3 days of what they call POR instruction, which is general preparation for overseas replacement. And again, we went to a rifle range, fired the M16 rifle, and did a few other military type things. And then I had a couple of weeks leave and flew out to San Francisco and got on a plane to go to Vietnam, which was a charter flight which carried soldiers to their assignments in Vietnam, and when they came back, and oddly enough, it was TWA was the airline, and some years later I worked for TWA after I got out of the Army, so that was kind of interesting. So once I arrived, then the next question was where I would go specifically, and I was assigned to an outfit called the 1st Signal Brigade, and it was a unit that was located at Long Binh, Vietnam, which was a huge logistical base, maybe about half an hour northeast of Saigon, and it was the biggest military base in Vietnam. And the 1st Signal Brigade was actually, brigade was kind of a misnomer in that it was a huge unit. We had something like 23,000 personnel, whereas a typical Army division, which is above a brigade, usually had only about 15,000. And we were responsible for all communications above the division level, up to and including to the U.S. We had satellite operations and a lot of very sophisticated communication stuff. And many of our soldiers were highly trained in the operation of this equipment, and probably had more technical training than most soldiers of their ranks. We had 6 subordinate signal groups that reported to the brigade headquarters where I was stationed, and 5 of them were located north and south in Vietnam. There was one in Saigon, there was one up in Phu Bai, which is the northernmost place before you reach the DMZ that separates south from the North Vietnam. And then we had one down the Mekong Delta, which is in the southernmost part of the country. And then we had a 6th one, which was actually located in Thailand. And we were responsible for the affairs of that group as well as the ones in Vietnam. So from time to time, I'd have to go to Thailand for one reason or another, and that, of course, was something that was very pleasant. Then beneath the battalions, there were, the brigades rather, there were signal battalions, signal companies, and they all had different missions to perform. And one of our jobs was to oversee their legal affairs. You know, there would be disciplinary issues that would arise in some of these units, and they might involve, in most cases, the administration of what's called non-judicial punishment, or colloquially known as Article 15s, which are administered by the commanding officer of the unit, and generally don't involve jail time or anything of that sort. And sometimes there would be more serious offenses that would come up, which would might eventuate in a court-martial proceeding. So we were responsible for making the arrangements for those when they occurred. Typically, I did not actually try these cases. I may have tried one or two while I was there, but mainly my job was to advise the convening authority, it's called, in this case the commanding general of the Signal Brigade, regarding the procedures that would be followed and what he needed to do after the court-martial was over, because in the military the results of the court-martial are reviewed by the convening authority, who is the one that appoints the court, and then he has to make a decision whether to uphold the court's findings or not do so. So it would be my job to advise him in that respect and review the record of the trial. And if there was a general court-martial, which is the most serious form of court-martial, there would be a verbatim transcript, and we'd have to read through that. There are 3 different levels of court-martial in the military. The most serious is a general court-martial, which generally here's what in civilian life we would think of as felonies. And then there are lower levels, which are special courts and summary courts, and they dealt mostly with minor offenses, such as short absences without leave, or in some cases non-aggravated drug possession. And although some of those would go to general courts, depending. I might add about our own legal office, there were 2 of us who were JAG officers, and I reported to a major who was the staff judge advocate, or chief legal officer of the brigade. He was a West Point graduate and a regular Army guy, and he came over around the same time as I did, and he was someone who would spend a career in the Army, whereas I was probably only going to be in for a 4-year obligation I had signed up for. And in addition to that, we had a number of enlisted personnel, a couple of whom were lawyers, but they were not JAG officers, and they would usually help soldiers who came in that had personal legal problems, and we had fairly good amount of that type of thing. So those are basically the things that I did while I was there. And I was in Vietnam for a year, and I would frequently, in addition to Thailand, we'd also travel around Vietnam visiting these other subordinate headquarters, and certainly I spent a lot more time doing that than going to Thailand. Well, it was really my first experience as a practicing lawyer. Of course, when I went to NYU, we learned about a great many different fields of substantive law, things like contracts and torts and property and criminal law and that type of thing. And unlike some people, as I say, I graduated from law school, I passed the bar, and went right into the Army. And the Army JAG School was very helpful in terms of learning more specifically what I would be confronted with when I went to a duty station, either in the U.S. or in Vietnam. And as such, once you actually get into it, there's a lot of things they don't teach you in law school, and to a certain extent we call OJT, on-the-job training. And I definitely felt I learned a lot from the experience. And while I certainly don't want to see us get into another war, I certainly think if we did wind up faced with that situation, I think it would be a good thing for my successors to do, to have sort of the same experience I had, and be of service to the Army and to the troops.
What would you describe as sort of the greatest challenge during your time in Vietnam that you had to face?
There was one incident that I could think of that probably was the most challenging thing I was involved with. At Long Bin, one of the installations that we had was the Army stockade or jail for military prisoners that would be facing court-martial or be sentenced. And this was a fairly large installation that was at Long Bin and was run by the military police. And unfortunately, our unit had a number of folks that were in there, either awaiting trial or having been sentenced. And this in the more serious cases where they'd been sentenced to over, say, 6 months, they would be sent back to the States to serve their time in places like Leavenworth. So we were attacked with rockets and rifle fire and this type of thing. My group was located fairly well inside the post, so we weren't directly exposed to small arms fire. But they did shoot rockets and mortars into the base, and some of which landed not far from where I was. In fact, I recall that there was one officer that was killed by a mortar fire not too far from where I was. And the most ironic part about it was he wasn't even assigned to Vietnam. He was there on a temporary assignment from the Pentagon and was due to go home like the next day. But this Tet Offensive, and Tet, by the way, is the Lunar New Year, which occurs in Vietnam as well as other countries in Asia. And they used this as an occasion to launch these offensives. But the one in 1968 was not as dramatic as the one in 67, and eventually the troops on the base fought them off. And by that, we didn't have a whole lot of infantry on the base. In fact, many people were cooks and, not medics, but other types of people. And they'd pick up weapons and return fire. So that was one thing that perhaps was not quite expected. It was a rather dramatic event in my service. But getting back to what happened with the stockade, about a month after this, there was a mutiny that took place within the stockade that was started by certain of the prisoners. And for a while, they pretty much took over control of the stockade until they were repulsed by reinforcements that came in and put it down. As a result of that, a number of people were identified as the ringleaders, and they were referred to general court-martial. And one of them was one of our people, and I got assigned to defend this person.
When you say our people?
Our people from the 1st Signal Brigade.
Oh, okay.
Most of the people there were from other units. And the prosecution came from a different Army headquarters, which is I was about the only, myself and my boss, whose name was Dan Shimmick, were about the only JAG officers at Long Bin that were assigned separately from the General Army headquarters, which is called U.S. Army Vietnam, and that's what most of the JAG people were. And somebody from there was the prosecutor, or what the Army calls trial counsel. And I was a defense counsel, and this case went to trial. And unfortunately, he was convicted. And he was sentenced to, I think, a dishonorable discharge and 2 or 3 years at Leavenworth. So he was rotated back to the States to serve his sentence. And later I learned that he appealed. If you're convicted by a general court-martial, you have a right to appeal within the military justice system to an appellate tribunal, which is called the Army Court of Military Review, which is back in Washington and consists of senior JAG officers, usually colonels. And so he appealed to that, but his conviction was affirmed. And eventually, I guess I didn't have any reason really to keep up with him. I'm what happened to him after that. Much of what I did was pretty much day-to-day stuff. Nothing I call terribly remarkable, except I was in the combat zone. And we did have a lot of involvement with a lot of the Signal Corps guys that were stationed around all over the country, and had various issues ranging from personal legal problems, as I mentioned before, to sometimes contract issues, because we also had attached to our unit some civilian contractors, 2 or 3 of them, that they had personnel over there who were civilians who ran some of our communications equipment. And some of them occasionally get into trouble. We had one guy in particular I remember who got involved in a fight in Saigon when he was off duty, and he was arrested by the military police, and then we had to decide whether we had jurisdiction to try this guy.
And that leads me to something I just thought of. Did you get in, I know there were a lot of Vietnamese locals who probably worked on the base. Did you get involved in any cases that involved local Vietnamese?
Not really. We did have local Vietnamese that worked for us. The one I most remember, I forget his name right now, but he worked in our motor pool. And he took care of maintaining the Jeeps and other vehicles that we had. In fact, that was one thing. I had a Jeep that was assigned me. I used to drive around the base, and we'd go down to Saigon occasionally, and we would go by Jeep, and I'd drive down there, or one of the other enlisted men would drive. Most of the other transportation, more distant from that, would be by air, mostly helicopters. So I got a lot of time in helicopters going to various places. And then the more distant ones, we would go by Air Force transport, the C-130s, which is a 4-engine turboprop airplane. We flew in those quite a bit.
Did you ever encounter actual hostile fire very close to you? I mean, were you ever in a situation, other than some of the base shelling and mortar attacks, anything that was, really scary?
Not really, although, you always worried about it, that something like that might happen, because we would, say, be driving down to Saigon, and we knew that from time to time they would attack people who were driving back and forth, so it was always a concern, but fortunately I never encountered it.
Looking back, how might you have handled certain situations differently in retrospect? It's
hard to say. I think we tried the best we could to do the best job we could. I don't know that I do anything really different. Well, when my tour of Vietnam was up in June of 1969, I was reassigned to the Judge Advocate General's office in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and I was stationed there for the remainder of my active duty. And my particular job there was I was in the Civil Litigation Division. And what we did was we acted together with the Department of Justice in defending lawsuits that were filed against the Army in civilian federal courts. And we had different types of cases that we were involved in. Most of the ones that I dealt with had to do with personnel matters. And the bulk of those concerned soldiers who were trying to get out of the Army before their tour was up. And the bulk of those were people who claimed to be conscientious objectors. Now, they'd been drafted or enlisted in the Army, and prior to service did not claim to be conscientious objectors, otherwise their objections would have been dealt with by selective service. But these were mostly people who didn't enter the Army. They went through basic training and advanced training, and in many of the cases, when they were faced with the reality that they were going to Vietnam, all of a sudden they were what their lawyers would call crystallized, and that is, and they developed a belief that they were opposed to war in any form, which is what they had to do. They couldn't just be opposed to the Vietnam War, they had to be opposed to all war. And then the Army had a procedure for dealing with these type of things, and an officer would hear their case and receive any evidence they might care to offer in support of their position. And the great bulk of cases, their claim would be denied. And then the soldier could appeal up through the chain of command, and eventually their case would get to Washington in the form of filing a lawsuit against the Army. In those days, there were various legal outfits or organizations that would set up shop outside military bases, and they would make themselves available to soldiers who wanted to fight the Army, either as conscientious objectors or wanting to get out for some other reason. And so they would file a lawsuit which is called a habeas corpus petition to have a federal judge declare them to be conscientious objectors and order them discharged. And we had quite a few of these cases, and as you might expect, a great many of them were filed in San Francisco, which was a place where the courts generally had a reputation as being more liberal than the federal courts that generally had jurisdiction over the Army bases in other parts of the country. Because generally they'd have to file a suit in a place where the soldier was present physically. Some of them even go AWOL from Fort Jackson or Fort Polk and then turn themselves in San Francisco, knowing that they'd be more favorable, or might be more favorably treated. And indeed, I'd say that was the case. We lost more of these in the Northern District of California than any other part of the country. And conversely, I also was involved in cases where the Army wanted to get rid of somebody and they wanted to stay in. Now, they were fewer in number, but they were usually more complex. So I did quite a lot of that. And a lot of the cases would involve my working with a Justice Department lawyer, usually an assistant U.S. attorney, who would actually go into court on these type of cases. But in some cases, I would actually go into court myself on behalf of the Army. And most of those were a case which involved court-martial convictions, where after the soldier had been denied relief in the military appellate system, they would then file a habeas corpus in civilian federal court. And so I would go in and defend the Army in those kind of cases because we knew a lot more about the military justice system than the average assistant U.S. attorney. And we won most of those cases, I would say. So I did this for about a year and a half, and then ultimately my term of service was up in January of 1971, 4 years after I went in. So the question arose, well, what am I going to do after I got out of the Army? And I had made the acquaintance during my tour in the Pentagon of folks who were in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. And that was an office that handled a fair amount of cases that I would be involved in dealing with the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. So at one point, the head of the Civil Division there, which is where these cases were handled, said to me, I understand you're getting out of the Army soon. I said, yeah. And he said, if you haven't made any decisions, we'd be interested in hiring you here to be an assistant U.S. attorney. And so I said, I don't even have to think about that. I would like that very much. So, I went through a series of interviews there, and I guess they made me an offer just before I got out of the Army. But actually starting the job was delayed by, I think it was about 6 weeks, because they had to do a full FBI investigation, and that take a certain period of time, and they go out and interview my neighbors and all these kind of things. So I took advantage of that period of time to travel in Europe, and I did that for about a month, and then when I came back, I got my FBI clearance and was ready to start. And you asked to what extent the Army had influence on what I did afterwards. In this case, there was quite a lot, because a lot of the cases I did came out of that same office when I was on active duty. Plus, I did a lot of other things in this office, and we really, the cases that we had ran the gamut of suits against the federal government. Everything ranging from somebody being hit by a mail truck to people who were trying to get an injunction against the Vietnam War. So it was quite an interesting experience, and I have to say I probably worked harder in that job than any place I ever worked as a lawyer, because we were very busy and we were understaffed. So I spent a lot of time, nights and weekends, in that office. People have the image of, government employees are not working all that hard. I can tell you that wasn't the case with me and my colleagues in that office. I also stayed in the Army Reserve once I got off active duty, and I was assigned to a unit in Washington where most of the other, it was a unit solely of Judge Advocate officers who were in the reserves, and most of us were government employees, and we would meet once a week and talk about latest developments in military law, and then had 2 weeks active duty every year. And I did that in the same office in the Pentagon that I had worked in previously for most of my reserve career. And I went off, I left the active reserve, I guess, after I'd had 28 years of combined active and reserve service. And one thing I did as a reservist in addition to that was I also taught military law at West Point. I did that for several years during my active duty period. So all the cadets would receive a 2-week instruction in military law, and while they had JAG officers as instructors in the law department up there, they weren't enough to meet this requirement, so they would call on people such as myself to help out. So I did that for 3 or 4 years. It was a very enjoyable experience. And, well, I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 4 years, and I left in 1975. At that point, I and a couple of other people from the office were hired by United Airlines to set up an in-house litigation department. And the idea was that they would use these folks to defend cases so that they would do more in-house than hiring outside law firms. So we all moved to Chicago. And for 3 years I did this. And I'd go all over the country handling litigation for United. And again, it was a great variety of stuff, everything from people complaining about lost baggage to more serious matters, firing of executives, who would file suit, be reinstated, employment discrimination cases, that type of thing. And after 3 years of that, United sent me to New York, where I became the chief lawyer on the East Coast for them, and my job was mainly to work with the personnel of what they then called the Eastern Division, which had responsibility for all of United's airport installations up and down the East Coast. And that was very interesting. A lot of it involved dealing with airport authority, like the Port Authority here in New York and New Jersey. Dealt with them quite a lot. And after that, then they wanted me to move back to Chicago, and because they were eliminating this Eastern Division and its counterpart in the West in a reorganization. And I decided, my wife and I decided we preferred to stay in New York, so I looked for other work, and I wound up becoming the Chief Labor and Employment Counsel for TWA. And I did that for about 13 years. Again, going to a lot of different courts in the country and handling litigation for them. And during that period, we had actually 4 cases that were argued in the U.S. Supreme Court. I didn't argue them. The outside counsel who specialized in that type of thing did, but I worked with them and attended all the arguments. So in 1994, TWA went to a reorganization, and make a long story short, they moved to St. Louis from the New York headquarters, was relocated. So at that time I decided to resign, and that's when I moved to New Jersey. And I worked for a couple of years with a company here in New Jersey, and then after that, in 1996, I decided to go into private practice. So I made contact with the law firm here in Summit, from whose offices I'm speaking to you now. And so actually I've been doing that now for over 20 years. It's probably the longest I've been in one place my whole career.
Curious about your encounter with other veterans of the era, and as I've talked with folks who've had Vietnam experience, have you, and the fact that you accumulated a 28-year active and reserve experience, has there been encounter with other vets in certain situations? Anything about that you might want to share?
I belong to a number of military-related groups, one of which is the Association of the U.S. Army, which I belonged to for many years. And they have an annual convention, which years ago I went to a couple of times, and then interfaced with a lot of active-duty military people, as well as other members. More recently, been involved with the American Legion here in Summit. We have an active post here, and I guess I joined about 3 or 4 years ago. And we meet regularly, and we have probably about 80 members or so from Summit and the surrounding areas. We don't all attend the meetings. I usually try to. Doesn't always coincide with my schedule. So we have several Vietnam veterans, and also some who more recently were in the military. Some may have only been in the National Guard and Reserve, and some were deployed, some were not. And I think we have 1 or 2 from go back to Korea. I know we had a fellow I remember who was a World War II veteran who later became an optometrist, and he had his office in this building. So he was our lone World War II vet for a while, but he's passed away. And so now I don't think we have anybody that goes back that far.
In terms of your private practice, not to get into great detail, but all of your experiences, did that lead to you wanting to focus in specific areas of law in your private practice?
Yes. Most of the work I did in private practice has been in the field of labor and employment law. A lot of my background in that comes from when I was in the Army JAG and the U.S. Attorney's Office and working for the airlines. The main difference was that in this practice I found myself representing employees more than employers, although I did have a few employer clients. So a lot of that was filing complaints against employers for employment discrimination, wrongful termination, things of this sort. Today I'm also doing things like estate planning, doing wills and trusts, people representing estates that are in administration, and also real estate. I know every lawyer here in Summit probably does a certain amount of house closings and that type of things.
What sort of advice or counsel might you give to, say, a high school or a college student who may be considering military service, be it in whatever career field in the military? From your experience, what sort of counsel might you give them on their thought process and what they might want to consider as they take a next step in their lives? Well,
for me, the military is a good experience. For the most part, thoroughly enjoyed my time in service, and this is probably not everybody's experience, but I would encourage young people to serve in the military. In fact, I met a young man just last week. We were out at the Far Hills races which you may be familiar with. And I was introduced to someone who's the son of someone I was acquainted with, and he was a graduating senior who was about to enter the Army. And he'd gone to, I believe, Wake Forest, and was in the ROTC there, and was about to receive his commission in the artillery. And was just about to go off to Fort Sill to artillery training. So, you know, I did my best to encourage him and say, you know, I think he'll, you know, just, you know, follow the rules, obey the orders, lawful orders of your superiors, and you should do fine. Very few people, you know, I think maybe 1% of the population today is in the military. It's very unlike when we had the draft and I guess in the years of the Vietnam War, and even in the early stages of the Middle East, we had more people exposed to the military than we have today. And so it's very different in terms of most civilians today have very little idea what the military is about. And in a way I think that's unfortunate. Although I can understand probably most people would prefer not to take 2 or 3 or 4 years out of their life for military service. But I think it's something that's worth pursuing, and of course also the extent to which people pursue military services, to some extent a function of what the civilian economy is doing, so that when you have a higher degree of unemployment, you have more people that are interested in going into the military, and vice versa. You know, just speaking back to my airline experience, when I worked for the airlines, almost all of our pilots were hired out of the military, the Navy, Air Force, and today that's not true. Most of them are not getting out. For one thing, the pay to entry-level pilots is quite low today compared to what people earn as, let's say, a major lieutenant colonel pilot in the military. And so today a lot of the pilots are hired from commuter airline. I even have a friend who was a jazz musician. He's a well-known guitarist around here. He's also a pilot. And he took flying lessons. He got his private pilot license and worked his way up, instrument rating, instructor license rating, and commercial license. He's now flying for Delta and playing the guitar. While I was in the Army, I took a master's in law degree at George Washington University, which was fully paid for by the Veterans Administration. And there I got an expertise in government procurement law, which was something I put to use when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office. When I went to work for TWA, I was interviewed by the Associate General Counsel. He'd been a Navy JAG and also a reservist. So, need I say more? And when I interviewed people, you know, I would frequently be in the hiring process. TWA, I was the head of a section, I hired people. And I always looked on military service, whether it's legal or otherwise, as a plus.